Welcome to Mind Sherlock. Today's case hides its truth in the smellest corner. The clues begin quietly, but the journey is unforgettable. Let us get started.
The rain has a language of its own in London, a soft, secretive rhythm that seems to murmur of guilt and memory. Somewhere beyond that veil of mist and soot, a map lies folded upon a desk. A map that once charted empires, and now charts only the ruin of a single heart. Tonight, we return to Baker Street, to the firelight, the silence, and the gaze of the one man who can read remorse as easily as another reads a confession. It is a story of intellect untempered by mercy, of coordinates drawn not upon parchment, but upon the soul. Before we set out, tell me, where are you listening from, and what hour keeps you company there? I'd like to know before we cross into this fog together. The train is waiting, the lamp burns low, and the mystery is about to begin. The morning broke in a dim grey wash across London, the sort of April dawn that renders every street a corridor of mist and melancholy. The rain had fallen steadily since midnight, tracing slow, uncertain paths along our sitting-room windows and dulling the sound of the city to a distant murmur. I recall that Holmes, seated cross-legged upon the hearthrug, appeared utterly indifferent to the weather, his eyes half closed in meditation, the morning paper lying untouched beside him. The fire had burned low, and its ashes emitted a faint odour of charred cedar, mingling with the sharper tang of Holmes's tobacco. He was in one of those moods of absolute stillness which precede some great awakening of thought, the calm before the flash of intellectual lightning that I had come to know so well. For my own part, I had resigned myself to the day's quiet, yet even in that subdued hour there was an expectancy about Baker Street, as though the air itself waited for the disturbance that fate, in its whimsical timing, was about to deliver. It was just upon 8 o'clock when a soft but hurried knock broke the silence. Holmes stirred, one hand rising lazily to his temple. "A visitor," he murmured, "and one in distress, judging by the rhythm." Before I could question him, Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression a blend of curiosity and concern. Behind her stood a young woman, drenched to the hem and trembling as though the damp London air itself had conspired against her courage. Her gloved hands clutched a parcel of folded paper, and the faint outline of water stains marred her sleeves. Her features, though delicate, bore the unmistakable pallor of one long deprived of rest. Holmes rose immediately, with that courtesy of manner he reserved for those in evident distress. "Pray, be seated, madam," he said gently, motioning her toward the chair nearest the fire. For a moment she hesitated, as though uncertain whether she had intruded upon sanctuary or judgment. Then, with a faint sigh, she obeyed, her eyes darting from Holmes to me and back again, as if seeking assurance that she would be heard without ridicule. "I am Miss Clara Vale," she began, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. "My uncle, Mr. Arthur Vale, was found dead 3 nights ago in his studio, in Bloomsbury. The police, they say it was an accident, that he overexerted himself. But it was not an accident, Mr. Holmes. I am convinced of it." Holmes inclined his head slightly, the faintest glimmer of interest crossing his eyes. "Pray continue, Miss Vale." She fumbled with the parcel in her lap, unwrapping its damp paper covering to reveal a single folded military map. "This was found upon his desk," she said, "but it does not belong there. My uncle was a cartographer, precise, methodical, incapable of leaving his work unfinished or disorderly. Yet this map is not his. The markings are wrong, the ink uneven. I believe someone placed it there after—" Her voice faltered. Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled. "You say the room was locked?" "Yes, from the inside. The window bolted, the key in his own pocket. But there was something else. A sound, the night before his death. I was staying with him then. I heard voices. His and another, low and unfamiliar. When I went to the landing, there was silence. She lowered her gaze, her composure collapsing into quiet despair. They told me grief can conjure imaginings, but I know what I heard. Holmes regarded her for several moments, the rain tapping insistently against the glass, like a clock marking each second of her confession. Without a word, Holmes extended his hand. She placed the folded parchment upon it. He unfolded it carefully and spread it upon the table between us, the edges still damp and curling. The map depicted a section of foreign coastline, somewhere in the South Atlantic, I judged. But certain lines appeared hastily altered, their ink darker and newer than the rest. Holmes drew his magnifying lens from his pocket and bent close. "Curious," he murmured. "The paper itself is of military grade, yet the seal has been scratched away. And here, do you see this faint indentation, Watson? A mark from the nib of a pen pressed too hard, as though the hand that made it trembled." He traced the tip of his finger along a jagged contour near the margin, pausing at a cluster of small, uneven symbols. "These additions," he said softly, "are not geographic at all. They are placed with intent, but not for navigation." Miss Vale watched him with growing apprehension, as though his scrutiny might uncover more than she wished to know. Holmes's expression, meanwhile, betrayed that subtle spark I had learned to recognize, the quiet thrill of a mind closing upon the scent of truth. Holmes questioned her gently, never pressing harder than civility allowed. "You spoke of your uncle's manner in the days before his death," he said. "Was there anything unusual?" "Yes," she replied. "He was restless, unlike himself. He would lock the studio for hours and forbid me to enter. He seemed hunted, Mr. Holmes, as if some unseen dread had fixed itself upon him. Once, I found him at the window, staring into the street, though there was no one there. He startled when I spoke." "Was he engaged upon any new commission?" She hesitated. "He mentioned a map for a government office, something confidential, but after his death, they denied all knowledge of it." As she spoke, her composure wavered between resolve and terror. The tremor in her gloved hand betrayed the strain. Holmes, listening with eyes half closed, asked in that low tone of his that always commanded truth, "And this visitor you overheard, you are certain it was a man?" "I cannot be sure," she whispered. The voice was low, muffled, perhaps by the door, but I heard the scrape of a chair and a faint metallic sound, like the fall of an instrument. "Ah," Holmes murmured, rising abruptly. "Fear, Miss Vale, is often more logical than it seems. You have done wisely to come." Her eyes lifted to him with sudden, desperate hope. "Then you believe me?" "I believe," said he, "that no map ever arrives in a dead man's hand without a reason." Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed upon the folded chart. Then, with a sudden flicker of decision, he turned to me. "Watson, your hat. We are needed in Bloomsbury before the day grows older." Miss Vale looked from one to the other of us, confusion mingling with relief. "You mean you will go there yourself?" "Indeed," Holmes replied. "The pattern is incomplete, but its geometry intrigues me. If your uncle's death was shaped by human design, it will not remain hidden long." He replaced the map within its wrappings, tucking it securely into his inner pocket. "Madam," he added, bowing slightly, "you have given me work worthy of the morning. And I dare say," he continued with that faint gleam of irony that so often lit his features, "the weather will do nothing to discourage inquiry." Within the quarter hour, we were descending the steps of Baker Street, Miss Vale walking between us beneath Holmes's umbrella. The drizzle had thickened to a fine, persistent rain, blurring the outlines of hansoms and gas lamps alike. The air smelt faintly of wet stone and horsehair, a scent that to me has always signalled the beginning of some new adventure. Holmes walked briskly, his head bent, his coat collar turned high against the damp. The folded map rested in his pocket like a silent conspirator. Once, as we passed the corner, I thought I saw a strange satisfaction in his eyes, the faintest upward curve at the edge of his mouth. Miss Vale said little, save to thank him once under her breath. Her voice was lost in the steady whisper of the rain. Thus we set forth into the grey streets of London, the three of us, bound by a map whose meaning none yet understood, and by a death that, to Holmes's mind, had already ceased to be an accident. The morning had scarcely broken when we left Baker Street, the fog lying low and yellow along the Thames, spreading like a restless tide through every lane of the city. The cab lamps swam in the murk as though we drifted upon some spectral sea, while the horses' hooves made a muffled rhythm upon the wet stones. Beside me, Holmes sat upright, his gaze fixed upon the dim outline of the street ahead, his mind clearly elsewhere. I had learned to recognize that silence of his, the pregnant stillness in which deduction formed silently, link upon link, until a single question might loose a torrent of reasoning. We passed the shadowed outline of the British Museum, its columns vanishing into the vapour, and turned into a narrower street where the houses leaned inward, dark and unwelcoming. Holmes spoke only once during the journey. Bloomsbury, Watson, has given birth to more heresies, philosophical and criminal alike, than any other quarter of London. Let us see which kind this morning offers us. The driver drew up before a modest brick dwelling, its shutters closed, and the pavement before it still damp from the night's rain. Miss Clara Vale waited upon the step, her expression one of anxious relief as Holmes alighted. From the moment we crossed the threshold, I was aware of an oppressive stillness that seemed to saturate the air. The narrow hall smelled faintly of varnish and drying paper, a scent both chemical and melancholy. Miss Vale's maid, a pale and tremulous creature, curtsied and whispered that the constable had left strict orders. Nothing in the studio was to be disturbed. Holmes gave a brief nod, his eyes already sweeping over the framed maps and survey instruments that lined the passage. "Ink and solitude, Watson," he murmured, "a most combustible mixture." We ascended a narrow stair to the upper landing, the boards creaking beneath our feet. The maid paused before a heavy door upon which an official seal had been fixed. Her fingers trembled as she pointed to it. "They told me to keep it locked, sir, till the inspector said otherwise." Holmes bent closer, examining the seal. His finger traced the wax without breaking it. "The police, then, have finished their inspection," he observed softly. "And yet they have left the most eloquent witness unseen, the room itself." He turned to Miss Vale. "If you will permit me, I shall have the door opened. The dead, Miss Vale, are seldom the only ones who leave their mark." The air that greeted us as the seal broke was dry, cold, and heavy with the residue of ink and oil. Holmes entered first, his movements deliberate, reverent almost, as though stepping into a cathedral of intellect stilled by death. Everywhere lay the evidence of Arthur Vale's precise and solitary craft. Charts were pinned in neat rows upon the walls, compasses and calipers arrayed with mathematical symmetry across the great drafting table. Yet there was an uncanny lifelessness to it all, the sense of an interrupted gesture. A protractor lay half-turned, its edge smudged with ink, and the compass upon the desk spun faintly when Holmes approached, its needle quivering as if uneasy in its bearings. Near the window, a lantern lay shattered upon the floor, its glass reduced to glittering fragments. The curtains hung limp and grey, filtering the meagre daylight into streaks that fell across the work table and Vale's final map, a great sheet of parchment still pinned in place. Holmes surveyed it all in silence. Then, crouching, he lifted the base of the fallen lamp. "No scorch mark," he murmured. "Yet the oil scent remains. Curious." He straightened slowly, his eyes roaming the walls, the shelves, the ceiling. "This room, Watson, has not merely seen death. It remembers it." While Holmes continued his silent survey, my attention was drawn to the great unfinished map spread across the desk. Its expanse of pale parchment was marred near the southern margin by a blot of dark red. irregular and spreading, like the outline of some distant island. I leaned closer, struck by the unnatural shade of it. "Holmes," I called softly, "see here. This stain." He joined me at once, bending over the parchment. Producing his magnifier, he examined the spot with the patient scrutiny of a jeweller at his bench. "Not upon the paper, Watson," he said at length, "but beneath it." Gently, he lifted the transparent overlay, a thin sheet used to preserve Vale's work, and revealed that the stain seeped from the underside, not the surface. "Blood?" I ventured. "Possibly. But note the direction of the flow, inward, toward the map's centre, not outward, as though something were placed here and removed before it dried. Remark the coincidence, too. The blot lies precisely upon the charted meridian Vale was last correcting." I felt a shiver despite the room's stillness. Holmes replaced the overlay with meticulous care. "A curious point, Watson, that a man should die over his life's work and yet leave behind a blemish that resists explanation." We had scarcely finished our examination when a brisk tread sounded in the passage, followed by the unmistakable voice of Inspector Lestrade. "Ah, there you are, Mr. Holmes. I might have known you could not resist meddling." Holmes greeted him with unruffled courtesy. "Merely observing, Lestrade. You will forgive me if I prefer to draw my conclusions from the evidence itself." Lestrade surveyed the room with the air of a man who has already sealed his case in his pocket. "Nothing mysterious here, sir. The gentleman was found dead at his table, the door locked, no sign of struggle. Apoplexy, plain as daylight. The doctor's report agrees, and I see no reason to trouble Scotland Yard with metaphysics." Holmes regarded him mildly. "And the lamp, shattered but unburned?" "Fell when the poor fellow collapsed," Lestrade replied briskly. "I should think that much obvious." Holmes smiled faintly. "Quite so. And yet it is the obvious, my dear Lestrade, that so often conceals the singular." The inspector sniffed. "Well, if you choose to chase shadows, you'll find no shortage in this fog. Good morning to you." He turned on his heel, leaving the scent of wet wool and official certainty in his wake. When the sound of Lestrade's footsteps faded, Holmes moved lightly about the room, his expression sharpened by purpose. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how a single truth can misalign an entire theory." He pointed first to the chair beside the table. "It has been moved. Note the pattern in the dust upon the floor. The chair was drawn back after Vale fell. By whom?" Next, he indicated a fine thread of soot upon the curtain's edge. "This is not from a domestic fire. It bears the faint metallic luster of lamp oil, yet the lantern itself remains unscorched. Therefore, the oil was spilled before the lamp was broken." He bent low, his nose almost to the floorboards. "And here, beneath the desk, a droplet of some clear, viscous substance. Oil, but of a purer distillation than any used for household illumination. Industrial, perhaps, or preservative." He straightened and met my gaze. "A faint odour of varnish and mercury. Tell me, my dear fellow, does apoplexy account for that?" I could only shake my head. "Precisely," said Holmes, the ghost of a smile passing over his face. "We stand amid contradictions, and contradictions are the most reliable companions of truth." We left the studio as dusk crept through the window panes, softening every outline into gloom. Holmes paused upon the threshold and cast one last look into the room, where the broken lamp and the crimson blot gleamed faintly in the fading light. He said nothing, nor did I, for there was a weight in the air that words could not relieve. Down in the street, the fog had thickened to a pale shroud that wrapped the houses and muffled the rumble of carriages. Holmes drew his coat close about him and started forward, his face grave and inward-looking. I matched his pace in silence, knowing that the true work of his mind had already begun. The lamps flared dimly through the mist as we turned the corner, and I could not help but feel that the fog itself conspired with the mystery, that both concealed what we were yet to discover. The following morning found us once again in the silent studio of the late Arthur Vale. The air retained that peculiar odour of ink and stale varnish, as if intellect itself had a scent which clung long after the mind had gone. Holmes stood before the great drafting table, his figure bent slightly, the faint grey light of an overcast day falling across his face. He moved not with haste, but with a deliberate, feline precision, his fingertips grazing the instruments. A scattered ruler here, a compass mislaid there. I saw him pause before the protractor, tilting it toward the light. "Reversed markings," he murmured, more to himself than to me. An error that could not escape Vale's notice. Therefore, it was not his. The silence of the room seemed to thrum with thought. I watched the smoke of Holmes's cigarette curl slowly upward, a single wisp drifting above the map table like an idea seeking form. The faint scratch of his fingernail upon the parchment was the only sound, and I knew from experience that the great machine of his mind was already in motion. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes at last, laying his hand upon the largest chart. "Here we have the measure of deceit itself." He placed a transparent overlay upon the surface, aligning it with the faint grid Vale had so meticulously drawn. "You will note," he continued, "that the meridians have been shifted, scarcely a quarter of a degree, but enough to mislead any reader unfamiliar with the original." He adjusted his lens, tracing the faintest smudge where two lines met. Someone tampered with this after Vale's death. The hand was nervous, uneven pressure, blurred strokes, yet purposeful. I bent closer, my untrained eye perceiving little save a tangle of ink. "You mean to say these alterations conceal something?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No, my dear fellow, they reveal something. It is only the unskilled liar who removes. The clever one adds. The deviations point toward the truth by their very intention to hide it." He leaned back, arms crossed. A cartographer's studio, a man dead among his instruments, and a world redrawn to mislead. The geometry of murder is a fascinating study. His words lingered like a challenge to the still air. It seemed to me, as I stood there beside the maps, that we were standing not in a workroom, but upon the very edge of the world it described, where accuracy met obsession, and one false line might doom an entire voyage. At that moment, a timid knock sounded at the door. Miss Vale, who had been waiting below, entered with a subdued air. "Mr. Schultz has arrived, Mr. Holmes. I thought perhaps you might wish to question him." Holmes inclined his head, and into the studio stepped a man of lean frame and uncertain bearing. Mr. Henrik Schultz bowed with continental politeness, his dark coat buttoned high and his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles whitened. His eyes were pale and restless, darting from the maps to the floor, from Holmes to me, as though measuring the moral latitude of the room. "You were Mr. Vale's assistant, I believe?" Holmes asked, his tone courteous but distant. "Yes, sir," replied the man in an accent that betrayed his Teutonic origin. "For 2 years I worked under him, in geography, in measurements." His words came quickly, each one emerging as if he feared it might betray him. "It was great honour, until this misfortune." There was an earnest tremor in his voice, but it was not sorrow. It was something more complex, the sound of a conscience calculating its chances. Holmes drew up a chair and motioned Schultz to sit. "Pray tell me, Mr. Schultz, when did you last see your employer alive?" 2 nights before," he answered at once. "He dismissed me early, said he had private work." "Indeed? Yet Miss Vale reports that the lamp in the studio burned late into the night of his death." Schultz's lips twitched. "That may be so, sir. I was not here." Holmes regarded him keenly. "You reside nearby, I understand, within easy walking distance." "Yes, in Great Russell Street. But I did not come that night. The constable, he knows this." Holmes tapped the protractor with a forefinger. "And this instrument, did you notice its reversed marking?" Schultz blinked rapidly. I cannot say. It is old. Perhaps it belonged to Mr. Vale from long ago." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A curious suggestion. The engraving style dates to within the last year. You may rest assured that I have observed its origin. Tell me, did your master ever alter his own maps after completion? Never, Schultz said quickly. He was exact man. Too exact. Holmes smiled slightly. Ah, then someone less exact has left his touch. The man swallowed hard, his fingers twitching upon his knee. His words began to contradict one another in subtle ways, claiming ignorance one moment, offering precision the next. The silence between his answers spoke louder than the words themselves. The interview ended with polite phrases, but the atmosphere was charged with mistrust. Schultz stood, bowed, and made to leave, yet his composure was that of a man escaping rather than departing. As he reached for the door, Holmes's tone softened. One more thing, Mr. Schultz. Did your late employer keep any of his earlier drafts? The man hesitated, the pause of a fraction of a second, but unmistakable. In that cabinet, I believe, he said, indicating a tall oak press near the corner. His voice was too casual, his glance too swift. When he had gone, I turned to Holmes. You saw it too? Holmes gave a brief nod. His eyes betrayed him. A man's pupils contract when his mind conceals a fact. It is the involuntary confession of the body. I could not help remarking that Schultz's tone, though respectful, carried an undertone of resentment, almost of fear. Yes, Holmes replied thoughtfully. Fear may be guilt, or it may be knowledge. The two are often mistaken for each other. He crossed to the cabinet, running his finger lightly along the brass keyhole, but he did not open it. For the moment, we shall let his secret rest where it lies. After Schultz's departure, Holmes resumed his circuit of the room. The grey daylight had shifted, throwing longer shadows across the maps. He paused before the inkstand, tilting it slightly, so that the residue glistened along the rim. Something caught his eye. A glimmer finer than dust, metallic and cold. He touched it delicately with the tip of his blade and held it up. Observe, Watson. A flake of metal, almost microscopic. From the drafting tools, perhaps, I suggested. Possibly, he said. Yet it carries a dull sheen of mercury. Vale's inks were vegetable, not mineral. This is foreign to his work. He replaced the fragment carefully in an envelope. Deceit leaves its residue, however fine the grain. Holmes then turned toward the half-finished chart and regarded it with quiet intensity. This alteration, this poison of falsehood, was not the act of an enemy. It bears the touch of one who knew his methods intimately. You believe Schultz to be the culprit, then? I asked. Holmes shook his head slowly. I believe him to be a symptom, not the disease. The words hung in the still air as he pocketed the envelope, his expression unreadable. As we stepped once more into the fog of Bloomsbury, I could not restrain my certainty. Holmes, it must be Schultz. His manner condemns him. Holmes's lips curved faintly. My dear Watson, the most dangerous compass is conviction before observation. Our longitude of guilt is yet uncharted. Let us proceed carefully, lest we mistake the glitter of error for the light of truth. And with that quiet admonition, we turned back toward the waiting hansom, the fog closing behind us, like the lid of a secret yet to be opened. Miss Vale stood beside us in the dusky parlour of her uncle's house, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the key in the brass-bound trunk. The lock yielded with a sigh, and a faint odour of old leather and sealing wax rose into the air. Holmes knelt immediately, his long fingers gliding over the contents with the delicacy of a surgeon. There were maps neatly rolled, several sketchbooks, and, most intriguing of all, a bundle of letters tied with black silk ribbon. The seal of the Royal Geographical Society, he murmured, holding one envelope toward the light. Another bore a red wax crest stamped for His Majesty's service. A curious mixture of science and secrecy, Watson, an alliance as old as empire itself. Miss Vale watched anxiously as Holmes withdrew a smaller packet, its wrapper marked "Confidential." The handwriting was Vale's, firm, ordered, yet betrayed by a single tremor that ran through the final signature. Holmes's expression softened for a moment. "A man at war with himself," he said quietly. "Let us see who commanded his surrender." We carried the documents to the desk, and Holmes spread them methodically beside the old map from the studio. Among the papers lay a leather-bound journal, its pages blotched and brittle. Holmes turned them with care, reading aloud occasional fragments in Vale's hand. "Southern Meridian. Expedition uncertain. Fitzroy impatient. Coordinates disputed. Must adjust to meet demand, yet map not honest." He looked up. "Do you observe the phrasing, Watson? Not incorrect, but not honest. A moral deviation disguised as a geographical one." The entries grew increasingly erratic. Vale wrote of a voyage to an uncharted coastal region, of arguments with his colleague Captain Fitzroy, and of a payment greater than prudence would justify. In the margins were rough sketches of coastlines erased and redrawn, and a strange annotation: "The meridian is only a line if the conscience permits." Holmes closed the journal with a measured snap. This man's guilt was not sudden. It grew like mildew, silent, corrosive, and invisible until it consumed the surface. Holmes turned his attention to the correspondence, aligning each letter chronologically. "Here," he said, "we have the first overture, the Society requesting Vale's expertise for a colonial survey. Then follows this, a memorandum from the Admiralty authorizing an expedition of cartographic verification." He held up the next page. "And yet, within a fortnight, the commission is withdrawn without explanation." The phrasing is bureaucratic, but the meaning unmistakable. Something was found that could not be sanctioned. Note, however, the check stub attached, payment in full. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. They paid him handsomely to forget, not to finish. But Vale, it seems, could do neither. He continued the work privately, perhaps under threat, perhaps out of obsession. In either case, his silence became fatal. I asked whether he thought this business connected to Fitzroy. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, wherever there is a shadow of authority, there is always a Fitzroy to stand beneath it." At Holmes's suggestion, we made our way that afternoon to the Royal Geographical Society in Pall Mall. The porter, an elderly veteran, recognized Vale's name at once, but it was the mention of Captain Fitzroy that loosened his tongue. "A brilliant man, sir. Too brilliant for his own safety," he told us. "They said he was dismissed for doctoring survey data, a colonial border, I believe. Claimed it was mere correction of error. Others called it forgery in uniform." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "And his relationship with Mr. Vale?" "Bitter, sir. The two worked side by side until that business in the South Atlantic. Afterward, Mr. Vale would cross the street rather than meet him." In the Society's records, Holmes discovered that Fitzroy had recently attempted to reinstate his membership, but was refused. His application bore a single line of endorsement, unsigned, written in ink nearly identical to that found on Vale's map. Holmes studied it in silence. When we emerged into the afternoon drizzle, he said only, "Fitzroy's quarrel was not with geography, Watson, but with truth itself. I suspect his revenge was drawn not in blood, but in ink." We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a single envelope left by a uniformed messenger. It bore no name, only the direction, "Dr. John Watson, companion to Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes slit it open and unfolded the short note within. "Certain investigations are best left to their proper guardians. The interests of the Empire must outweigh private curiosity." There was no signature. Holmes's brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "A warning, Watson. The language of bureaucracy attempting the tone of threat. A poor composition." He passed the note to me. "We tread now upon official nerves, and they twitch." "Then you mean to continue?" I asked. He smiled. Naturally. There is nothing more dangerous than a mystery someone wishes to remain unsolved, especially when that someone represents His Majesty's government. Outside, the rain began anew, tapping faintly upon the window pane like the ticking of a clock marking some invisible countdown. That evening, after a sparse supper, Holmes drew his chair close to the hearth. The firelight fell upon the array of charts, letters and sketches spread across the table. For an hour he worked in silence, tracing lines, adjusting angles, redrawing coastlines. His pencil moved with the rhythm of one unravelling both map and mind. At last he spoke. "See here, Watson. When I align Vale's altered coordinates with the notes in his journal, the route forms an impossible curve, a path leading not to sea, but inland, toward a region marked blank on every official chart." He shaded the area gently with his pencil. To erase a mountain or an island is a matter of ink. To erase a scandal requires the same instrument wielded by a more experienced hand. He leaned back, folding his long fingers together. Vale was asked to falsify his findings for reasons of state. When conscience forbade him, others completed the work, and paid him to accept the lie. But the map he could not bring himself to draw truthfully became in the end the instrument of his destruction. The fire crackled softly. Holmes regarded the glowing coals, his features thrown into deep relief. "The most dangerous journeys, Watson," he said at last, "are not those upon the seas or in the deserts, but those taken within a man's conscience. The way is narrow, and few reach its end unscathed." I made no reply, for his words seemed to fill the room like smoke. Dense, lingering, and oddly prophetic. It was 3 days after our last visit to the Vale residence that the coroner's inquest was convened in the drawing-room of that sombre house. The air within was heavy with the scent of damp wood and varnish, and the low murmur of official conversation seemed to echo from the bare walls like the verdict of an unseen jury. Miss Vale sat pale and composed beside the hearth, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, while Lestrade, brisk and immovable as ever, dominated the proceedings with the assurance of authority. The evidence was perfunctory. The servant spoke of the locked door, the absence of disturbance, and the victim's recent complaint of dizziness. The doctor testified that a blood vessel in the brain had given way, producing instant death. Holmes listened with his usual detachment, his gaze fixed not upon the witnesses, but upon a small inkblot upon the coroner's notes. When the jury retired, the verdict was swift and unanimous. Death by natural causes. Apoplexy. A murmur of relief passed among the assembled officials, yet as the room emptied and the voices receded, I could not help feeling that something vital had been left unsaid, a truth smothered beneath the blanket of official satisfaction. Holmes waited until the last of the jurors had departed before he rose from his chair and adjusted his gloves. "Nature, my dear Watson," he said softly, "seldom chooses so tidy an exit." I turned to him in surprise. "You doubt the medical report?" "I doubt the simplicity of it," he replied. "Mr. Vale's life's work was the correction of error, not its creation. A man so devoted to accuracy rarely dies by coincidence. You will recall, perhaps, that ink stain upon his fingers. I propose we grant the dead the courtesy of one last examination, not of his body, but of his instruments." Miss Vale, overhearing, gave a faint nod of consent. "Everything remains as it was, Mr. Holmes. The constable locked the studio after you left." "Excellent," Holmes said, his tone brightening with purpose. "Then let us pay another visit to our cartographer's last workspace. The truth, like a map, must sometimes be read beneath the surface." He gathered his hat and cane, and with that we left the oppressive air of officialdom for the cool drizzle outside, the verdict echoing behind us like the closing of a false ledger. The studio received us with its usual silence, that strange, watchful hush which seems to linger in rooms that have once held death. Holmes went straight to the desk and took up Vale's fountain pen, which lay beside a blotter stiffened with dried ink. He drew off the cap examined the nib, and sniffed lightly at the barrel. "Curious," he murmured. "Do you detect it, Watson? That faint, metallic odour, not of ordinary gall ink, but something more caustic." He turned the pen upright and let a single drop fall upon the copper edge of his magnifier case. The reaction was immediate. The metal darkened, a thin curl of smoke rising into the still air. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, as I suspected, our friend Mr. Vale was writing his own epitaph. In mercury." I stared at him. "You mean this ink was poisoned?" "More precisely, it was poisonous. A pigment used in certain technical inks, hydrogyrum peroxidatum, exceedingly rare and highly volatile. In a confined space, its vapour could prove fatal. A most elegant weapon, silent, invisible, and self-erasing. Whoever filled this pen meant its owner to perish by his own hand, though not by his own intent." He replaced the pen upon the desk with the gentleness one accords to a loaded pistol. "Come, Watson, we shall see what further secrets this deadly scribe conceals, under more forgiving light." That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes set about his experiments with a methodical calm that concealed his inward excitement. The fire burned low, and the familiar clutter of the sitting room had been transformed into a chemist's bench. Retorts gleamed faintly in the lamplight, and a faint haze of metallic vapour hovered above them. Holmes poured a few drops of the recovered ink into a glass tube and applied heat. "Watch closely, Watson," he said. "Note the change in colour, from blue-black to silver-grey. And now," he held a strip of silver wire above the vapour. Within moments, the bright surface dulled to a blackish film. "There is our proof. The ink contains a mercury compound. It was no accident of composition." He proceeded to mix the remaining sample with a mild acid, observing how it released a sharp, acrid odour that filled the room. "You see," he continued, "how readily the air becomes contaminated. In a sealed chamber, such as Vale's studio, the effect would have been cumulative, the slow asphyxiation of intellect by its own tool." I could not help but marvel. Then the death was not instantaneous. Not at all. The poison would induce dizziness, tremor, and finally collapse. Apoplexy indeed, but of an artificial kind. It was murder by the geometry of air. He extinguished the lamp, leaving the room in shadow. "We have unmasked the weapon, Watson. Only the hand remains unseen." Holmes resumed his seat by the hearth and, with eyes half closed, began to reconstruct the fatal night aloud, his tone quiet and measured. "Imagine, if you will, our unfortunate cartographer bent over his map. The window closed, the door locked. He dips his pen, the reservoir filled not with ink, but with death. As he writes, the mercury vapour rises, invisible, odourless, save for a faint metallic tang he scarcely notices. His hand trembles. He believes it weariness. His pulse quickens. He calls it strain. The room grows warm, heavy, suffocating. He overturns the lamp, not by accident, but in confusion. Within moments, consciousness slips away. When the morning comes, the poison has vanished with the air, and the cause is written off as nature's whim. I shuddered. A cruelly scientific crime, Holmes, conceived with almost perverse intelligence. He nodded. It is the mark of one who understands both science and guilt. And consider, only a person with access to his instruments could have prepared that ink. Someone who wished his death to resemble fatigue, not malice. The elegance of it nearly redeems the wickedness, but not quite. His eyes burned in the half-light. We have crossed from deceit of cartography into deceit of conscience, my dear fellow, and I have no doubt the same hand drew both. Early the next morning, Holmes presented his findings to Lestrade at Scotland Yard. The inspector listened with an expression of increasing scepticism, his pen tapping impatiently upon the desk. "Mercury vapour, poisoned ink, all very clever, Mr. Holmes," he said at last. "But I'll warrant the coroner knows his business. You can't hang a man for a chemical notion." Holmes merely smiled. Nor can one hang the truth by ignoring it. I suggest you await the full autopsy report. It will mention traces of mercury in the lungs, sufficient, I think, to revise your verdict of natural causes. Lestrade gave a grunt of irritation. If you're wrong, you'll answer for the time wasted. Holmes rose, his manner serene. If I am wrong, Inspector, the world will lose nothing but a theory. If I am right, it will have gained justice, and perhaps a measure of humility. We left him glowering behind his desk, the wheels of officialdom grinding reluctantly against the sharper machinery of deduction. That evening, as twilight deepened beyond the windows of Baker Street, Holmes sat silent before the folded map spread upon our table. The crimson blot, once meaningless, now seemed to pulse with significance beneath the lamplight. He regarded it for a long moment before speaking. He was slain by his own instrument of truth, Watson, he said softly. The map was never the only thing falsified. The fire crackled faintly. Outside, the city hummed like a distant sea, untroubled by the quiet discovery of one man's ruin and of another's genius in exposing it. The evening was drawing in grey and soundless when Miss Vale was announced at Baker Street. She appeared more haggard than when we had last seen her, a woman haunted by the twin burdens of loyalty and remorse. The lamplight, falling softly upon her pale features, revealed the tremor of a decision long resisted. Holmes greeted her with gentle formality and motioned her to the chair nearest the fire. She clasped her gloved hands tightly together, as if seeking courage from their pressure. For a time she could not speak. The clock ticked in measured patience, and Holmes waited without a word, his gaze fixed upon the faint curls of smoke rising from his pipe. At last, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, she said, "Mr. Holmes, I have not told you everything." Holmes inclined his head slightly. Truth, Miss Vale, is seldom born in a single utterance. It arrives, as we do, step by step. She lowered her eyes. There was a visitor that night, one I did not name. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his hand still upon the arm of his chair. The silence between them deepened, as though London itself held its breath. Holmes leaned forward, his voice quiet and colourless. "You say there was a visitor. Let us not strain your conscience with conjecture. Simply tell us the truth." Her composure faltered. "It was Mrs. Eleanor Fitzroy," she whispered, her gaze darting upward with sudden fear. "The wife of Captain Fitzroy, my uncle's former associate. She came the evening before his death." Holmes's eyes narrowed, though his tone remained calm. "Did she come by appointment?" "I cannot say. I found her in the hall when I returned from an errand. She seemed nervous, almost ashamed. My uncle received her at once. They were together perhaps half an hour. When she left, he bade me good night and locked the studio door. It was the last time I saw him alive." A faint colour had returned to her cheeks, though the effort of confession seemed to exhaust her. "I kept silent because I feared to dishonour his memory. He was a man of intellect, Mr. Holmes, and she a woman easily misunderstood." Holmes rose and looked out into the fog-darkened street. "The living, Miss Vale, are often more dangerous to memory than the dead. I thank you for your candour." At Holmes's suggestion, I returned the next morning to the Vale residence, where the constable admitted me with the air of one grown weary of mystery. The studio remained sealed in its grim repose, yet the moment I stepped inside, a sensation arrested me, faint but distinct. The air carried a trace of perfume, light as a whisper, clinging still to the curtains and papers. It was not a common fragrance. Jasmine, I thought, with some subtler note beneath it, something refined, deliberate, feminine. I recalled Miss Vale's modest attire and plain manner, and knew instinctively the scent was foreign to the house. I stood for several minutes by the desk, letting the impression sharpen itself. The odour was strongest near the easel, where a stool stood askew and a blot of blue pigment marred the floorboards. The place seemed to breathe the memory of a presence, elegant, secret, and out of harmony with the scholar's austere world. I left the room with a strange unease, the perfume following me faintly down the stairwell, as though some invisible witness still lingered in the shadows of the house. My curiosity, once roused, would not rest. Before quitting the premises, I resolved to make one final circuit of the studio. Kneeling beside the easel where the scent was strongest, I passed my hand beneath the heavy stool. My fingers brushed something soft and yielding. It was a woman's glove, white kid, finely stitched and faintly perfumed with jasmine. The fingertips bore minute smears of paint, dried and cracked, and along the wrist ran a faint reddish streak, the hue of Vale's map ink. The glove was recent, the leather still retained its suppleness, and the lining was warm from the closeness of the room. I stood motionless, turning it over in my hand. It was a tangible intrusion of the feminine into a realm of geometry and solitude. The intimacy of it struck me like a whisper overheard. A woman had sat there, leaned there, perhaps wept there. I placed the glove carefully in my pocket and departed, my mind already formulating the words with which Holmes would receive this evidence. Yet even before I reached Baker Street, I fancied I could still smell that faint, treacherous sweetness rising from the folds of my coat. Holmes was awaiting me upon my return, his violin resting idly upon his knee. He listened without interruption as I described my discovery, then requested the glove, which he examined under the lamplight with quiet satisfaction. A woman's hand, small and narrow. The stain of ink confirms contact with Vale's map table. She was here, Watson, and not by accident. He turned the glove over once more, then rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he had earlier placed a framed photograph retrieved from the Vale studio. It depicted a group of men in military dress standing before a tent, the caption reading Survey Expedition, South Atlantic Coast, 1885. Among them stood a single woman, dressed in travelling attire, her gaze directed not at the camera, but toward the man beside her. Arthur Vale. Holmes pointed with the end of his bow. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzroy. There can be no doubt. Her presence in the photograph and later in his studio links her not only to his past, but to his conscience. A dangerous combination, my dear fellow. He set the frame down gently, his features unreadable. It would appear that Mrs. Fitzroy's map was drawn long before this case began. Only the boundaries have changed. We sent for Miss Vale that same evening. When she entered, her composure was restored, though her eyes betrayed the sleepless hours that had passed since her confession. Holmes, without preamble, placed the glove upon the table between them. She stared at it, her breath catching. "So you know," she murmured. "I thought perhaps it would end with my silence." Holmes regarded her steadily. "Truth is indifferent to silence, Miss Vale. It waits, patient as the tide." Tears glistened in her eyes, yet her voice remained steady. "I had guessed there was once an affection, though I swear it was never improper. My uncle admired her mind, her courage. They shared ideas others could not understand. But when Captain Fitzroy began to suspect, she withdrew. That night she must have come to beg him to destroy whatever bound them." Holmes made no reply. He stood by the window, the smoke of his cigarette curling upward in the stillness. She watched him for a moment, as though seeking judgment in his silence, and finding none, lowered her gaze once more. When at last we took our leave of the house, night had fallen and a fine drizzle lay upon the streets. Holmes walked beside me in thoughtful silence, his collar turned up against the damp. The lamps along the Strand burned dimly through the mist, their glow diffused like pools of liquid amber. At length he spoke, more to himself than to me. "There are few things more persistent than a woman's influence, Watson. A word may fade, a letter may burn, but scent endures. It clings to fabric, to air, even to the conscience. A woman's perfume may outlast her presence, and sometimes her innocence." I made no reply, for the truth of his words carried its own melancholy. As we turned the corner toward Baker Street, a faint trace of jasmine seemed to linger in the night air behind us, elusive and unresolved, like a memory that refuses to be forgotten. The hour was past midnight, and the fog had thickened outside our windows until even the gas lamps shone as dim, muffled orbs. Within our sitting room, however, the atmosphere was bright with that particular intensity which always attended Holmes when he was engaged upon a mystery that tested both his intellect and his heart. The air hung heavy with tobacco smoke. The faint hiss of the fire mingled with the steady tap of Holmes's dividers upon the map spread before him. He had drawn his chair close to the table, his long, thin fingers tracing invisible lines over the parchment. The instruments of his trade lay scattered in careful disorder: a magnifying glass, a compass, several rulers, and a single candle guttering low beside his elbow. His eyes gleamed with quiet ferocity beneath the brim of his dressing gown, and his lips moved in half-formed murmurs that betrayed the rapidity of his thought. For my part, I watched in respectful silence, my pen poised above the page of my notes. I had seen Holmes in many moods: the ironic philosopher, the bored ascetic, the merciless reasoner, but rarely this: a man possessed, almost haunted, by the need to make sense of what lay before him. The silence was not one of idleness, but of pure concentration, and even the tick of the clock seemed to hold its breath in sympathy. At length, Holmes straightened in his chair and turned the map slightly toward the lamplight. "Observe, Watson," he said softly, "how the lines here near the southern meridian appear uneven to the eye, yet no tremor of hand could account for such discrepancy. Something lies beneath." He held the sheet delicately by its corners and lifted it before the flame. The parchment thinned into translucence, and through it one could discern faint underlines, ghostly tracings that diverged from the drawn coastlines like the echo of an earlier design. Some were erased almost to invisibility, others crossed one another with mathematical precision. Holmes smiled faintly. "Our late cartographer was not merely redrawing the world, Watson. He was concealing one." He lowered the sheet and studied it again with the glass, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. "See these indentations here? Double lines, reversed at intervals, not random, but systematic." He pressed too deeply for mere correction. There is intent in every stroke. I felt a chill of awe. "You believe he was encoding something?" "Precisely so," Holmes replied, his tone grave. "Not a new continent, but a message meant for discovery. The hand that traced these lines did not falter from confusion, but from conflict. Let us see what conscience inscribed upon geography." Holmes fetched from his desk a ruler, a compass, and a small logarithmic table which I had never before seen him use outside the realm of cipher analysis. He measured the intervals between the misdrawn meridians, muttering figures beneath his breath. 61 degrees west, then abruptly shifted to 73. Absurd from a geographical standpoint, yet entirely consistent if one seeks a cipher grid. He beckoned me nearer. "Mark the intersections of these altered lines, Watson. Do they form any recognizable shape?" I complied, tracing the points upon a separate sheet. The result seemed meaningless, a tangle of crossing coordinates without symmetry or sense. "Nothing that the eye can follow," I confessed. "Ah," said Holmes with quiet satisfaction, "but the eye is a deceptive instrument. Try the mind instead." He adjusted the compass, drawing arcs between the irregular points until the apparent chaos began to suggest pattern. "You see? The arrangement is not random. It follows the spacing of letters, not degrees. A cartographer's grid adapted for words rather than worlds." I watched him reconstruct the map piece by piece, his concentration absolute. "A cipher hidden in longitude," I murmured. He nodded. "Exactly. Vale's last labour was not to chart the earth, but to translate remorse into mathematics." For nearly an hour Holmes worked in silence, his pencil gliding swiftly, his brow furrowed in that peculiar tension I had come to associate with Revelation's edge. At last he leaned back, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. Watson, kindly draw these lines as I direct. Begin here, from the false equator to the altered meridian. Yes, now the next, curving eastward. So, do you perceive it? As the new configuration emerged upon the parchment, a pattern took shape. Faint, deliberate, astonishing. Two sets of initials intertwined upon the map's center, as if the continents themselves had been reshaped to form them. Beneath, in the smallest of Vale's fine lettering, appeared three almost invisible words. Forgive me. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The fire hissed, and the paper trembled faintly between Holmes's fingers. It was his confession, I said at last, my voice low. Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, concealed within the geometry of his profession, where no one but a fellow devotee of precision might find it. You see, Watson, remorse has its own form of symmetry. The heart seeks to balance itself even when reason forbids it. Vale's pen could not speak openly, so it wrote through artifice, through the only language he trusted, coordinates and measure. He touched the delicate letters gently, as though unwilling to disturb the dead man's final message. He charted not the world, but his soul. Holmes replaced the map upon the table and leaned back in his chair, the glow of the lamp softening his features. You perceive now, Watson, the tragedy of the man. At the moment of death, his intellect remained clear, even serene. Yet his spirit was in turmoil. He sought atonement not by word or will, but by method. Each line, each adjustment, was an act of penitence disguised as correction. I felt a deep melancholy steal upon me as I gazed at the faint inscription. How strange, I murmured. That genius so often meets its end in solitude. He might have confessed to the world, or to her. Holmes's eyes flickered toward me, and yet, perhaps he feared her forgiveness more than her anger. Some guilt is too refined to bear exposure. It must bury itself beneath a surface, in this case, the surface of the globe. He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. Consider, too, that this confession required calm deliberation. He must have known the poison's onset, and used his final strength to record remorse before reason left him entirely. A man dying in agony, yet composing the geometry of his own absolution. There is tragedy enough to chill the blood. The lamplight trembled on the parchment, and for an instant I imagined that the letters themselves wavered, as though the dead man's spirit still hovered over its work, reluctant to let go. Holmes broke the silence. You observe, of course, that the initials are not ambiguous. A.V. for Arthur Vale, E.F. for Eleanor Fitzroy. The message was meant for her alone. I nodded slowly. Then his remorse concerned the woman, not the false map. Possibly both, said Holmes. There is a curious equilibrium between guilt and affection. He may have betrayed her confidence, or exposed her husband's deceit, or perhaps merely loved her beyond propriety. In any case, this silent entreaty suggests that conscience, not corruption, dictated his last act. He rose and paced the length of the room. We have pursued this case through science and suspicion, and yet it leads us now into the fog of emotion, that territory where reason mislays its compass. What precisely he sought forgiveness for, we may never learn, but it is certain that Mrs. Fitzroy's shadow stretches across every inch of this tragedy. He paused by the window, his figure dark against the faint glow of London's mist. A man may alter a map, Watson, but not his heart. The boundaries drawn there are indelible. Holmes stood for some time in contemplation, before folding the map along its worn creases. He placed it carefully within its case, as though returning a relic to its tomb. Every chart deceives twice, he said at last, his voice low. Once the eye, and once the heart. The first can be corrected. The second, never. I looked at him, uncertain whether he spoke of Vale or of mankind itself. The fire had burned to embers, and the fog pressed against the panes like a living thing. Holmes extinguished the lamp, leaving only the faint glimmer of coals upon the hearth. As I set down my pen, I could not help but think that in deciphering Vale's final map, Holmes had touched upon a region no compass could measure, that dim frontier between knowledge and mercy where even genius must falter. The silence that followed was profound, save for the whisper of the dying fire, like the breath of a world whose secrets had, for a moment, been understood. The clock had struck 11 when Holmes began his reconstruction of the fatal night. The rain outside drummed faintly against the windows, and the dim lamplight cast long, wavering shadows upon the table where the infamous map lay unfolded. The faint stains upon its surface seemed almost alive in that uncertain glow, as if the paper itself were struggling to recall the tragedy it had witnessed. Holmes sat opposite me, his face pale and intent, the lean fingers of one hand tracing invisible lines upon the map's border. "We must look backward," he said softly, "not with the eyes of conjecture, but with those of logic and pity. The dead, Watson, cannot speak, yet their silence, if read correctly, may prove eloquent." He leaned forward, his gaze fixed upon the map. Picture it, my friend, a man alone in his studio, his conscience pressing upon him like a weight of stone. The ink bottle open, the lamp burning low, the night cold and watchful. Into this solitude steps another, carrying the final spark that will set the tragedy ablaze. The smoke from his pipe rose like a thin veil between us. I felt as though we were not in Baker Street at all, but in that dim chamber once more, listening to the quiet pulse of guilt before it broke into ruin. Holmes's voice took on a measured cadence, as if he were dictating events to the air itself. At 10:30, Mr. Henrik Schultz returned to the Vale residence. He had already visited once that afternoon under the pretext of retrieving his notebook, but his true purpose was darker. He sought to confront his master, or perhaps to absolve himself of complicity. He lifted his eyes toward me. "You will recall, Watson, the man's nervous temperament and his particular care in pronouncing moral virtue. Such men often live closest to betrayal." Schultz entered by the side door, the one the maid swore was bolted. He had his own key. Inside, he found Vale still at his drafting table, the map before him incomplete. Holmes paused, letting the scene assemble itself in my mind. Words were exchanged, bitter and restrained at first. Schultz accused him outright. The coordinates were false, deliberately falsified to exonerate Captain Fitzroy from the charge of tampering with imperial data. Vale, though weakened by conscience, denied it. Schultz threatened exposure before the Geographical Society, even hinted that he would send the correspondence to the press. That, I believe, was the spark. I could almost hear the echo of their voices, two minds bound by intellect, yet divided by honour, quarrelling in the stillness of night. Holmes rose from his chair, his silhouette cutting sharply against the lamplight. The quarrel, though brief, was violent in its essence. Schultz was younger, more impassioned, Vale, frail and remorseful. Yet pride lent him momentary strength. He refused to alter the map, refused to destroy what he had drawn, declaring that a lie once committed must bear its own consequence. Holmes's tone softened. There was a scuffle. The compass overturned. The lamp struck askew. In their struggle, the glass chimney fell, releasing the subtle fumes from that infernal ink. The mercury vapour rose swiftly in the confined space, unseen yet deadly. Schultz, startled by the accident, fled the room in confusion, leaving the door unlatched behind him. He resumed his seat, the faintest sigh escaping him. And Vale, poor Vale, remained. Dizziness overcame him, the pulse slowed, and the body's strength yielded to the poison. His last conscious act was to grasp the pen that had betrayed him and inscribe, upon the very map of his deceit, a line that only remorse could have traced. The sound of the rain deepened, as though echoing the final rhythm of that silent confession. Holmes's voice grew lower, almost meditative. Yet one more figure watched the scene unfold, though unseen by either man. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzroy had come to the house that night, driven by fear of discovery. She sought to recover the map, the single piece of evidence that could condemn both her husband and herself. Her knock went unanswered. The maid had retired. She found the side door unlatched. Schultz had fled in haste and entered quietly. He pointed toward the map upon our table. I believe she reached the landing just as the lamp fell. Through the half-open door she saw Vale stagger, saw the rising smoke, perhaps heard his gasp. Terror seized her. Instead of rushing to aid him, she turned and fled, leaving the door ajar. It is to her shadow, Watson, that we owe the smudge of perfume found upon the air and the glove beneath the stool. A long pause followed. The irony, of course, he added, is that her purpose was needless. The map she meant to destroy had already been transformed into confession, a plea not for secrecy, but for forgiveness. She came to silence the truth, yet found it already speaking in death's language. The quiet that followed seemed heavier than before. For some moments, Holmes said nothing. His gaze rested upon the small brass compass lying beside the map, the same that had spun so wildly in Vale's studio. He turned it gently with his finger, watching the needle tremble. The whirling compass, he murmured, was no mere curiosity, Watson. The vapor's metallic particles disturbed the magnet's balance. Yes, but it was also emblematic of the minds entangled in this affair. Each sought direction and found only distortion. Vale's intellect turned inward upon itself. Schultz's conscience oscillated between truth and self-preservation. Mrs. Fitzroy's morality, swayed by devotion and deceit, lost all bearing. He looked up at me, his expression unusually grave. Even the best instruments falter when the atmosphere grows, poisoned. That is as true of human virtue as of metal. You see, the compass could not point north, because none of them could. There was in his tone a depth I had seldom heard, not triumph, but pity. For all his brilliance, Holmes carried within him a strange compassion for the fallen. It was as though he, too, recognized how fragile the line is between clarity and corruption. Holmes folded his hands and spoke with measured calm. There remains one final question. Who struck the first note of deceit? The answer, I think, lies not with Schultz, nor even with Vale, but with Mrs. Fitzroy herself. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp once more. It was she who persuaded Vale to alter the coordinates, pleading that her husband's honour and the Empire's reputation depended upon it. Vale, bound by affection and weakness, complied, though the act haunted him thereafter. Schultz, discovering the falsification, became the reluctant accomplice until conscience drove him to confrontation. Thus each bore guilt, yet hers was the seed. I frowned. Then she is the true instigator. Indeed, said Holmes quietly, though her hands remain unstained. Fate employed subtler tools than violence. The poison, the quarrel, the fall, all were but consequences of a single whisper uttered months before. For my husband's sake, alter the line. One might almost call it poetic justice, had it not been so tragically human. He rose, drew the curtain aside, and looked out into the rain. There are crimes, Watson, that require no gallows, only remembrance. Holmes turned back to the table. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly against the hearthstone. With careful precision, he folded the map along its creases and placed it beside the compass, whose needle now lay still at last. He regarded them for a long moment, then said, "Direction, my dear Watson, is never a matter of geography alone." His words lingered in the quiet room like the echo of a sermon. I watched as he extinguished the lamp and seated himself once more by the window, the rain still whispering beyond the glass. There was in his posture a peculiar weariness, not of mind, but of spirit. As I gathered my notes, I reflected that the case of the cartographer's death had revealed not merely the perils of deception, but the limits of reason itself. For even Holmes, master of deduction, could not chart the moral fog that surrounds the human heart. Outside, the city slept under its shroud of mist, and within our little room on Baker Street, the compass of truth had, for a moment, ceased to spin. A pale dawn mist hung low over the iron arches of Victoria Station, softening the clatter of wheels and the hiss of departing engines into something curiously mournful. Holmes and I stood apart from the crowd, half hidden behind a luggage trolley, our eyes fixed upon the single figure moving slowly down the platform under Inspector Lestrade's discreet escort. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzroy wore a dark travelling cloak and veil. Her step was steady, but her countenance, when the wind lifted the fabric for an instant, revealed a composure born not of peace, but exhaustion. She paused once beside the carriage door, glancing briefly toward the grey sky above the platform, not as if in prayer, but in resignation. Holmes watched her closely, his expression unreadable. "There goes a woman," he murmured, "whose heart charted a course her conscience could not follow." I could find no words in answer. The train whistle blew, shrill and final, and in a rush of steam and iron the carriage rolled from view. The veil of mist closed behind it, swallowing the sound. Holmes did not stir until the platform lay empty once more. Then he turned sharply toward the exit, his eyes still upon that vanishing plume of smoke. We had just reached the open concourse when Lestrade joined us, his face pale from the morning chill, but touched with a composure bordering on relief. He removed his bowler hat with a gesture almost deferential. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, "the lady is safely on her way to Calais. I've arranged for the papers to note her sudden departure due to ill health. It will spare unnecessary talk." Holmes inclined his head. "A commendable discretion, Inspector. I fancy her punishment will not require the assistance of the law." Lestrade hesitated, then gave a short, almost awkward nod. "Between ourselves, sir, I'll not deny the case belongs entirely to you. I thought it an apoplexy from the first. And you, well, you saw the truth in a bottle of ink. Scotland Yard can't compete with that." Holmes smiled faintly. "A fortunate alignment of observation, not genius. Still, the Empire owes you for its silence." Lestrade looked faintly puzzled by the remark, then shrugged. "Good day to you, gentlemen." As he walked away, the echo of his footsteps mingled with the distant rumble of departing trains, a fitting overture to a mystery quietly laid to rest. The cab that carried us back toward Baker Street moved slowly through the pale fog that clung to London like a second dawn. Neither Holmes nor I spoke. He sat opposite me, his hands folded beneath his chin, his gaze fixed beyond the misted window where church spires and rooftops drifted past like the half-remembered fragments of a dream. For my own part, I found my thoughts curiously unsettled. The law had been satisfied by concealment, justice by something more ambiguous. Eleanor Fitzroy's exile seemed neither a sentence nor an absolution. She had acted from loyalty, yet brought ruin through deceit. I wondered if the balance of guilt in this affair had been measured at all, or whether it simply dissolved into the London fog, leaving only regret. Holmes's silence was not the stillness of peace, but of thought too heavy for utterance. I saw in the hard line of his mouth and the faraway gleam of his eyes that his mind had withdrawn into that cold region of abstraction where emotion cannot follow. Once, as the cab turned past St. James's, he said quietly, "The geometry of truth, Watson, is seldom symmetrical." Then he fell silent again, and the rhythm of the wheels filled the space between us. When at last we climbed the familiar steps to our rooms, the warmth of the hearth greeted us with almost unnatural cheer. Mrs. Hudson had left tea upon the table, and the fire crackled in lively contrast to the damp world outside. Yet I could not shake the sensation that we had brought the chill of the case home with us. Holmes removed his coat and seated himself in the armchair nearest the fire, but the heat seemed not to reach him. Upon the small table beside him lay the folded map, the same that had begun this entire affair. Its edges were frayed, its ink dulled by time, yet there was something in its presence that drew all light toward it. Holmes's eyes rested upon it with an intensity that unsettled me. He neither smoked nor spoke. His hands, clasped before him, remained perfectly still. For some time, I busied myself with the teapot, but when I turned back, he was tracing the faint outline of the continents through the paper, as though seeking something invisible to ordinary sight. I knew better than to interrupt him, yet even I felt the moral weight of that folded world pressing upon the quiet of our room. At length, Holmes spoke, more to himself than to me. Every coordinate ends where conscience begins, Watson. Vale understood that in the end, too late perhaps, but with the precision of a dying man. He unfolded the map and laid it flat upon his knee, his finger moving along the faded meridians. See how orderly it is, exact, mathematical, certain. Yet beneath it ran a second world, the world of deceit, a single line displaced, and an empire is misled. But what of the heart that draws such lines? The intellect that corrects others' errors, yet conceals its own? Vale was no murderer, yet he became the instrument of his own destruction by mistaking knowledge for virtue. He fell silent, then added, "The same may be said of Mrs. Fitzroy, and perhaps of us all. To understand the world, one must first decide whether truth is to be served or survived." The firelight flickered across his face, carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. For once there was no triumph in his tone, only a weary compassion, the quiet ache of a man who had charted too many moral territories to find comfort in any of them. I realized then that the map before him was not of geography, but of the soul, and that no compass could ever truly measure its degrees. Later that evening, when Holmes had retreated into his customary silence, I drew my chair to the desk and opened my journal. The events of the past fortnight seemed already distant, as though seen through the haze of that poisoned studio or the smoke of our own lamplight. I wrote that night of Arthur Vale, of genius turned inward until its brilliance became a snare, of Mrs. Fitzroy, whose love had masked deceit, and of Schultz, whose righteousness collapsed beneath fear. Yet, as I dipped my pen, I found my thoughts returning again and again to Holmes himself. There was in him a strange solitude which even victory could not dispel. He had seen into the recesses of human error too often to believe entirely in virtue, yet too honourable to surrender to cynicism. I wondered if his great intellect, so finely balanced, might one day tilt under the very weight of the truths it revealed. As I closed the journal, the fire burned low, and the ticking of the clock seemed louder than before. The room felt vast and still, as though even time hesitated to disturb his thoughts. It was near midnight when Holmes rose from his chair. The lamp had burned low, and its flame trembled like a weary sentinel. He extinguished it with a gentle motion, and stood for a moment in the half-darkness, the folded map resting beneath his hand. "Even the truest compass," he said softly, "cannot point to forgiveness." The words hung in the quiet air long after he had turned toward his room. I remained by the hearth, watching the last ember fade into ash, and reflecting that in Holmes's world, truth was often found, but peace seldom. So ended the affair of the death in the cartographer's studio, and though justice had been done, it left behind a silence deeper than guilt, the silence of men who have looked too long upon the human heart, and found there both map and mystery. Holmes sat motionless for a long while after the case was done, the folded map resting like a secret upon his knee. The fire burned low, and the faint ticking of the clock was the only sound in Baker Street. At last, he spoke. "Every deception, Watson," he said softly, "is but a confession in disguise. Vale falsified a line upon a chart, but it was the lie he drew within himself that destroyed him. One cannot alter truth, only delay the hour of its return." I nodded, though uneasily. "And Mrs. Fitzroy?" I asked. Do you believe remorse will find her? Holmes gave a thin smile. Remorse, my dear fellow, has the keenest sense of direction. It never loses its way. He turned to the window, where the fog drifted past like the ghosts of unspoken confessions. Tell me, what do you believe was the true cause of Vale's downfall? Guilt, love, or pride? I should like to read your theory below. If you enjoyed this investigation into the darker corners of human conscience, share your thoughts, subscribe for more Holmesian mysteries, and invite a friend to join us for the next case that awaits in the fog.